You keep feeling like you're getting closer to them, like something real is forming. Like if you just try a little harder, give a little more, understand them a little deeper, it's finally going to click. But instead, something strange keeps happening. Just when it starts to feel warm, they go cold. Just when you feel connected, they pull away. And no matter how much effort you pour into bonding, it feels like you're always the one left confused, overthinking, and emotionally drained. What if the problem isn't your effort, but the way you're bonding in the first place? What if, without realizing it, you're doing everything in a way that actually pushes an avoidant further away instead of drawing them closer? Because bonding with an avoidant doesn't follow normal rules. In fact, the more you try to bond in the way that feels natural to you, the more disconnected they begin to feel. And that's the painful truth most people never see until it's too late. You're not failing because you're not enough. You're struggling because you're bonding incorrectly. It starts with something that feels so real, so convincing, that you don't question it. The long conversations, the moments where they open up just enough, the subtle signs of affection, the small bits of attention that feel meaningful. You interpret these as progress, as emotional closeness growing between you. You tell yourself this is how bonding happens, slowly, naturally over time. But what you don't realize is that what feels like bonding to you isn't the same experience for them. You're building emotional depth while they're managing emotional exposure. You're attaching meaning to moments while they're simply experiencing them in isolation. And this creates an invisible gap because while you're moving forward emotionally, they're staying in place or even stepping back without you noticing. That's why it feels confusing. That's why it feels inconsistent, because the connection you think is forming isn't forming in the same way on their side. And the more you lean into it, the more pressure they start to feel internally, even if you're doing nothing wrong on the surface. This is the illusion of connection. It looks like bonding, it feels like bonding, but in reality, it's a one-sided emotional build that an avoidant slowly begins to resist. And then comes the moment that hurts the most. When you feel like things are finally getting closer, they begin to pull away. Not because something bad happened, not because you did something obviously wrong, but because to them it suddenly feels like too much. Too much closeness, too much expectation, too much emotional weight forming around something they're not ready to carry. You might replay everything in your mind, trying to figure out where it went wrong. Was it something you said? Something you did? But the truth is it wasn't a single moment, it was the pace. You were bonding faster than they could handle. What feels like a normal emotional rhythm to you feels overwhelming to them. And avoidants don't process overwhelm by leaning in. They process it by creating distance. So when you try to move closer, they instinctively move away to restore their sense of control. And the more you try to close that distance, the more they feel the need to protect themselves from it. This is why moving too fast doesn't just fail, it backfires. Because in their world, closeness isn't comforting. It's something that has to be carefully regulated. And when it starts to build too quickly, their instinct isn't to deepen the bond, it's to escape it. But here's where it becomes even more complicated. Because while you're trying to bond emotionally, they're not operating from that same place. You might believe that opening up, expressing feelings, sharing vulnerability is what creates connection. And with most people, that's true. But with an avoidant, it doesn't land the same way. When you express deep emotions, they don't always feel closer. Sometimes they feel pressured. Sometimes they feel like they're being pulled into something they don't fully understand or feel ready for. Because they don't bond primarily through emotional intensity, they bond through comfort, through low pressure presence, through interactions that don't demand too much from them internally. So when you lead with emotion, thinking it will bring you closer, it can actually create the opposite effect. It highlights the difference between how you connect and how they connect. And instead of bridging the gap, it widens it. You begin to feel like you're giving more and getting less. They begin to feel like they're being asked for something they don't know how to give. And slowly, without either of you fully understanding why, the connection starts to strain. That's when you start trying harder. You become more available, more responsive, more present. You think that by showing consistency, by always being there, by proving that you're safe and reliable, you'll strengthen the bond. But this is where one of the biggest mistakes happens, because what feels like love and effort from your side can feel like pressure and predictability from theirs. When you're always available, always responding, always showing up in the same way, it removes the space they subconsciously need to feel comfortable. It creates a dynamic where they don't have to lean in because you're already doing all the emotional work. And over time, this reduces their investment, not increases it. They begin to take a step back, not because they don't care, but because the dynamic no longer feels balanced. You're giving too much without requiring anything in return, and in the avoidant mind, that doesn't create safety. It creates a quiet discomfort they can't always explain. So instead of appreciating the consistency in the way you expect, they start to withdraw from it. And that's the part that feels the most unfair, because you're doing everything right, just in the wrong way for them. And then, without even realizing it, you start pushing for something deeper, more meaningful conversations, more emotional clarity, more reassurance about where things are going. It feels natural. When you care about someone, you want to understand them. You want to feel secure. You want to know that what you're building is real. But for an avoidant, these deeper conversations can feel like stepping into territory they're not ready for. Not because they don't have feelings, but because accessing and expressing those feelings doesn't come easily to them. So when you try to go deeper, they don't always follow. Sometimes they deflect, sometimes they shut down, sometimes they give you just enough to keep things going, but not enough to truly satisfy your need for connection. And that leaves you feeling even more confused, because now it's not just distance, it's emotional inconsistency. One moment they seem open, the next moment they seem closed, and you don't know which version is real, but both are real. One is the part of them that wants connection, the other is the part of them that fears it. And when you try to force depth too early, you trigger that fear before the connection has had a chance to stabilize. That's why it collapses. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't paced in a way they could handle. So you start to question yourself. Maybe you're too much. Maybe you're expecting too much. Maybe if you just adjust a little more, be a little more patient, give a little more space, while still staying close, it will finally work. But the truth is, this isn't about becoming less of who you are. It's about understanding that bonding with an avoidant requires a completely different approach than what feels natural. It's not about intensity, it's about restraint. It's not about constant closeness. It's about strategic distance. It's not about pouring everything out. It's about knowing when to hold back. Because with an avoidant, connection doesn't grow through pressure. It grows through space. It doesn't deepen through emotional demand. It deepens through emotional safety. And safety, for them, doesn't mean more. It often means less. Less urgency, less expectation, less emotional weight placed on every interaction. When you shift the way you bond, everything begins to change. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly, in a way that finally aligns with how they experience connection. And that's when they start to lean in, not because you chased them there, but because you stopped pushing them away in ways you didn't even realize you were doing. And that's the shift most people struggle to make because it feels so unnatural at first. You've been taught that bonding means showing up more, giving more, expressing more, but here, doing more is exactly what breaks the connection. So without even realizing it, you fall into another pattern that feels right, but slowly pulls everything apart. You start giving reassurance. You try to make them feel safe by reminding them you're not going anywhere, by showing them consistency, by softening every moment of distance with understanding. You think that if they feel secure enough, they'll finally relax into the connection. But what actually happens is something you don't expect. The more reassurance you give, the less they feel the need to step forward. Because reassurance, when it's constant and unearned, removes the emotional tension that creates attraction. It tells them without words that no matter how little they give, they still have your full presence. And while that might sound like love to an avoidant, it creates a subtle imbalance. They don't feel closer, they feel less urgency, less curiosity, less pull toward you. And over time, that quiet shift changes everything. You begin to feel like you're holding the connection together on your own, while they become more passive, more distant, more comfortable, staying exactly where they are, not because they don't care, but because they no longer feel the need to move toward you. You've already made it too easy for them to stay where they are, and then comes the moment where their need for space becomes impossible to ignore. They start replying slower, they seem less engaged, the energy shifts, and you can feel it without them saying a word, and your instinct is to close that gap, to check in more, to ask if something's wrong, to try and bring things back to how they were. But this is where the pattern quietly breaks the bond even further. Because for an avoidant, Space isn't a sign that something is wrong. It's how they regulate themselves when things start to feel like too much. It's how they return to a place where they feel in control again. So when you move closer in response to their distance, it doesn't feel comforting to them. It feels like their space is being taken away. And that creates pressure, not loud, obvious pressure, but a quiet internal pressure that makes them want to pull away even more. This is the part that hurts the most, because from your perspective, you're trying to fix things. You're trying to protect the connection. But from their perspective, it feels like they're being pushed into something they're trying to step back from. And the more you try to close that distance, the more they feel the need to create it. That's the paradox. The closer you try to get, the further they go. Not because they don't feel something, but because they feel too much in a way they don't know how to handle. And somewhere in the middle of all this, your energy starts to shift. You stop simply connecting and you start chasing. It doesn't feel like chasing at first. It feels like caring. It feels like effort. It feels like you're just trying not to lose something important, but the dynamic changes. You're the one initiating more. You're the one trying to keep the conversation alive. You're the one thinking about them more, adjusting more, investing more. And they feel that shift even if they can't explain it, because chasing carries a certain energy. It's not grounded. It's not calm. It has urgency behind it. And avoidants are extremely sensitive to that kind of emotional pressure. So instead of pulling them closer, it triggers their instinct to step back. Not consciously, not intentionally, but automatically. Because when someone starts chasing them, it feels like they're being cornered emotionally. And their response to that feeling is distance. So the more you try to hold on, the more the connection starts to slip. And that's when it becomes exhausting. Because now you're not just trying to bond, you're trying to keep something from falling apart. And the harder you try, the more it feels like you're losing control of it. Then there's the way you respond when they pull away. Because no matter how much you try to stay calm, it affects you. You feel the shift, you feel the distance, and it brings up questions, doubts, emotions that are hard to ignore. So sometimes you react, maybe not dramatically, maybe not in a way you think is overwhelming, but enough for them to feel it. A change in your tone, a slight frustration, a need for clarity. And while those reactions are completely human, they have an impact you might not realize. Because when an avoidant senses emotional reaction to their distance, it reinforces the very thing they're trying to avoid. It makes the connection feel heavier, more complicated, more emotionally demanding. And that pushes them further into withdrawal. Not because your feelings are wrong, but because they don't know how to meet them without feeling overwhelmed. So instead of leaning in and reassuring you, they create more space to escape that emotional intensity. And this is where the cycle locks in. They pull away, you react, they pull away more. And both of you end up feeling misunderstood. You feel like they don't care enough to meet you. They feel like they're being asked for more than they can give, and neither side feels safe anymore. At some point, without even realizing it, you may start trying to fix them. Not in an obvious way, not in a controlling way, but in a subtle, well-intentioned way. You try to understand them deeply. You try to help them open up. You try to show them that it's safe to feel, safe to connect, safe to stay. You believe that if they just realize they don't have to be this way, everything will finally fall into place. But this is one of the most delicate mistakes because it comes from a place of care, yet creates the opposite effect. Avoidants don't respond well to feeling like they need to be changed, even if that change is positive. It makes them feel like they're being analyzed, like something about them isn't enough as it is, and that creates resistance. Because instead of feeling accepted, they feel exposed. Instead of feeling understood, they feel pressured to become someone they're not ready to be. So even though your intention is to bring them closer, it ends up making them guard themselves even more. They start holding back parts of themselves, not because they don't trust you, but because they don't want to feel like a problem that needs to be solved. And that creates a quiet distance that grows over time. Because now, it's not just about connection, it's about protection. Protection from feeling like they're being pulled into something they're not ready for, or shaped into something they didn't choose. And this is where everything begins to come together in a way that's hard to accept, but necessary to understand. You weren't bonding incorrectly because you didn't care enough. You were bonding incorrectly because you cared in a way that didn't match how they receive connection. Every extra effort, every emotional step forward, every attempt to secure the bond, It all came from a genuine place. But with an avoidant, intention isn't what determines the outcome. Alignment does. And when your way of bonding doesn't align with their way of processing closeness, it creates friction instead of connection. That's why it felt like you were doing everything right and still getting the wrong result. Because in this dynamic, doing what feels right to you can feel overwhelming to them, and unless that pattern shifts, the same cycle will repeat, no matter how much you try to adjust within the same approach. But here's the part that changes everything. If you truly understand it, the goal isn't to stop bonding. The goal is to bond in a way that doesn't trigger their defenses, to create a connection that feels light instead of heavy, safe instead of demanding, present instead of consuming. And that requires a level of awareness that most people never develop because it goes against instinct. It means stepping back when you want to step forward. It means holding your emotions steady when you want to express them. It means allowing space where you normally try to fill it. And while that might feel like you're doing less, what you're actually doing is creating the exact environment where an avoidant can finally start to move toward you on their own. Not because they have to, but because they feel safe enough to want to. And when that shift happens, even in the smallest way, everything begins to feel different. The connection starts to breathe instead of suffocate. The distance stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like rhythm. And for the first time, you're no longer chasing something that keeps slipping away. You're allowing something to grow at a pace that can actually last. And when you finally begin to step back in that way, something unexpected happens inside you. At first, it feels uncomfortable, almost like you're doing something wrong. You're not reaching out as much, not filling every silence, not trying to pull them closer when you feel the distance. There's a quiet tension in that space because you're so used to being the one who maintains the connection. But as that space settles, you start to notice something deeper. You realize how much of your energy was going into trying to keep something alive that was never meant to be forced. And in that realization, a different kind of awareness begins to form. You start to see the difference between attention and real bonding, because before it felt like the constant texting, the frequent check-ins, the small daily interactions were building something meaningful. It felt like presence. It felt like closeness. But now you begin to understand that attention alone isn't connection. Attention can exist without depth. Attention can be given out of habit, out of convenience, even out of boredom. And avoidants often operate in that space more than you realize. They can give you moments, give you interaction, give you just enough to keep things going, without ever fully stepping into a deeper emotional bond. And when you confuse that attention for something more, you start investing in something that isn't growing the way you think it is. That's why it feels so draining, because you're attaching meaning to something that on their side doesn't carry the same emotional weight. And once you see that clearly, it changes how you respond. You stop chasing attention and you start recognizing what real connection actually looks like. Something slower, quieter, but far more genuine. And with that awareness comes another shift that most people never make. You start to notice how, without meaning to, you were rewarding their distance. Every time they pulled away, you adjusted. You became softer, more understanding, more available when they came back. You accepted less, hoping it would eventually turn into more. And in doing that, you created a pattern where their withdrawal didn't cost them anything. In fact, it worked in their favor. Because no matter how inconsistent they were, the connection remained waiting for them exactly where they left it. And over time, that teaches them something without words. It teaches them that they can come and go without losing you, that they don't need to meet you halfway to keep you. And that realization, as painful as it is, becomes a turning point, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start to understand that bonding isn't just about what you give, it's also about what you allow. And when you allow inconsistency without any shift in your energy, you unintentionally reinforce it. But when you begin to change that dynamic, not through punishment or games, but through self-respect, everything starts to rebalance. Because now your presence is no longer guaranteed in the same way. It's something that has to be met, not just received. And that subtle change is what begins to shift the entire connection. At the same time, something else begins to change within you. You start letting go of the need to be fully understood all the time. Before, there was this urge to explain yourself, to make sure they saw your intentions, your feelings, your depth. You wanted clarity. You wanted them to understand what you meant, what you felt, what you needed. But with an avoidant, too much explanation can feel overwhelming. Even if it's coming from a genuine place, it creates emotional weight that they don't always know how to process. So instead of bringing them closer, it can cause them to shut down or disengage. And this is where you begin to discover the power of saying less, not in a way that hides who you are, but in a way that allows space for them to come toward you instead of feeling pulled. Because when everything is explained, everything is laid out, there's no room left for curiosity, no space for them to lean in and figure you out on their own. And avoidants, more than most, need that space. They need to feel like they're choosing to engage, not being guided into it. So when you step back from over-explaining, when you allow your presence to exist without constant emotional translation, something subtle shifts. The dynamic becomes lighter, less pressured, and in that lightness, they begin to feel more comfortable stepping forward in their own way, not because they were told to, but because they finally feel like they can. And as that shift deepens, you start to see something even more clearly. The traditional way you believed bonding should work doesn't apply here. The rules you thought were universal aren't universal at all. Because with most people, consistency, emotional openness, reassurance, and effort lead to deeper connection. But here, those same things, when applied in the same way, can create distance instead. And accepting that is one of the hardest parts because it forces you to let go of what feels fair. It forces you to step out of the idea that if you give more, you should receive more. Because with an avoidant, the connection doesn't follow a linear path, it moves in waves. In moments of closeness, followed by moments of distance. And instead of trying to fight that pattern, you begin to understand it. You stop expecting it to behave like something it's not, and in doing that, you remove a huge amount of internal pressure from yourself. Because now, when they pull back, it doesn't immediately feel like something is wrong. It feels like part of the rhythm, something to observe, not react to. And that calm understanding changes how you show up. You're no longer trying to force stability into something that naturally fluctuates. You're learning how to stay grounded within it. And that grounded energy is what an avoidant feels more than anything else. It's what slowly allows them to trust the connection without feeling like they're losing themselves inside it. But maybe one of the most important shifts happens in how you define emotional safety. Because before, safety meant closeness. It meant consistency, reassurance, emotional availability. It meant knowing where you stand and feeling secure in it. But for an avoidant, safety often looks very different. Safety means not feeling pressured, not feeling like they have to perform emotionally, not feeling like every interaction carries an expectation they might not be able to meet. So when you bring too much intensity, even if it's positive, it can feel unsafe to them. And that's where the disconnect begins. Because you're trying to create safety through closeness while they're trying to find safety through space. And until those two perspectives meet somewhere in the middle, the bond will always feel unstable. But when you start to understand their version of safety, when you begin to create an environment where they don't feel overwhelmed, something begins to shift. They start relaxing in small ways, opening up in moments that aren't forced, staying present a little longer than before. And it's subtle. It's not dramatic or obvious, but it's real. Because for them, connection isn't something that happens all at once. It's something that builds quietly, in spaces where they don't feel like they have to protect themselves. And when you become that space, without losing yourself in the process, that's when the bond finally begins to form in a way that doesn't break under pressure. And as you begin to fully step into that understanding, there's one final layer that quietly reveals itself, the part where you realize that trying to lock this connection down too soon was never going to work, no matter how perfect everything felt in the beginning. Because when something feels good, when there's chemistry, when there are moments that feel real and rare, it's natural to want to secure it, to define it, to make sure it doesn't slip away. You want clarity. You want direction. You want to feel like you're building towards something stable. But for an avoidant, that sense of locking in can feel like losing freedom. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a quiet, internal shift, where the connection suddenly feels heavier than it did before. Expectations start to form, even if they're unspoken. And expectations to an avoidant can feel like pressure. So when you try to define things too early, when you subtly or directly push for commitment before they've reached that place on their own, it triggers their instinct to create distance again. Not because they don't see potential, but because they feel like they're being moved faster than they can process. And the more meaningful the connection feels, the more intense that pressure becomes for them. That's why things can feel perfect one moment and uncertain the next. Because as soon as it starts to feel like something they might lose themselves in, their instinct is to step back and regain control. And this is where patience becomes something deeper than just waiting. It becomes understanding timing in a way that aligns with how they experience connection, not just how you do. And within that patience, you start to notice the push and pull pattern in a completely different way. Before, it felt chaotic, confusing, even painful. One moment they were warm, present, engaged, and the next distant, quiet, hard to reach. It felt like inconsistency, like something unstable that you needed to fix or figure out. But now you begin to see that this pattern isn't random, it's how they manage closeness. The moments where they lean in are real. The moments where they pull back are also real. It's not a game, and it's not manipulation in the way it can sometimes feel. It's a cycle that comes from wanting connection while also fearing the vulnerability that comes with it. And when you stop reacting to that cycle emotionally, when you stop trying to force it into a straight line, something inside you becomes calmer. You no longer feel like every shift is a threat to the connection. You begin to hold your position instead of chasing theirs. And in doing that, you create a kind of stability that doesn't rely on their behavior constantly staying the same, because it won't, not in the way you once expected, but your ability to remain steady within that fluctuation. That's what changes everything. That's what slowly teaches them that closeness doesn't have to mean losing control, and distance doesn't have to mean losing you. And as that calm steadiness becomes part of how you show up, you begin to realize something even deeper about yourself. You see how much of your previous bonding came from a place of fear. Fear of losing them, fear of not being enough. Fear that if you didn't give more, do more, try harder, the connection would disappear. And that fear shaped everything. It made you overextend, over-explain, over-invest. It made you ignore your own needs just to keep the connection alive. But when you step out of that fear, when you begin to ground yourself in something stronger, something more stable within you, your entire energy shifts. You're no longer trying to hold on to something that feels like it could slip away at any moment. You're choosing to be present in something that either grows naturally or doesn't. And that difference is powerful, because an avoidant can feel that shift. They can feel when your energy is rooted in fear versus when it's rooted in self-control. And what draws them in isn't intensity, it's that quiet strength, that sense that you're not trying to take anything from them. You're simply allowing something to build if it's meant to. And this is where the final truth settles in, the one that ties everything together in a way that's both freeing and grounding at the same time. Bonding with an avoidant was never about doing more. It was about doing differently. It was about understanding that connection for them grows in spaces where it isn't being forced, in moments where there's no pressure to perform emotionally, no urgency to define everything, no expectation that every interaction has to lead somewhere deeper right away. And when you align with that, when you allow the connection to exist without constantly trying to shape it, it begins to evolve in a way that feels natural instead of strained. They start to lean in, not because they were convinced to, but because they feel safe enough to want to. They start to open up, not because they were asked to, but because they don't feel like they have to protect themselves in the same way anymore. And those moments, even if they're small, carry more weight than all the forced closeness in the past. Because they're real, they're chosen, they're not driven by pressure, but by comfort. But at the same time, this understanding brings clarity in another direction too. It shows you that no matter how much you adjust, no matter how well you align, a connection still requires mutual effort to truly grow. You can create the right environment, you can show up in a way that doesn't trigger their defenses, you can become someone who understands them on a deeper level, but you cannot build the entire bond on your own. And recognizing that is just as important as everything else, because it brings you back to yourself. It reminds you that while understanding them matters, valuing your own emotional experience matters just as much. That bonding correctly doesn't mean losing yourself in the process. It means finding a balance where connection can grow without costing you your sense of stability, your sense of worth, your sense of peace. And when you reach that point, something inside you becomes still, not in a way that disconnects you, but in a way that grounds you. You're no longer caught in the constant cycle of trying to figure them out, trying to fix the dynamic, trying to hold everything together. You're present, aware, open, but not attached in a way that breaks you. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. You can see their patterns without taking them personally. You can feel the connection without needing to control it. You can give without overgiving and step back without fear. And that's when bonding finally starts to happen in the way it was always meant to, not forced, not rushed, not one-sided, but something that builds slowly, naturally, in a space where both people can exist without feeling overwhelmed. So if you've been feeling like nothing you do is working, like no matter how much you try, the connection keeps slipping through your hands, it's not because you're not enough. It's because the way you were trying to bond wasn't aligned with how they experience connection. And once you see that clearly, you stop chasing something that keeps breaking and start allowing something that can finally hold.